A diver descends into the Mediterranean depths off a Greek island in 1901, searching for sponges, when his hand brushes against something that shouldn't exist. Not treasure, not pottery, but a machine, a device so sophisticated that it would take humanity another 1,000 years to create anything remotely similar. This is not science fiction. This is archaeology. We live in an age where we believe we understand our past. We've drawn neat timelines, labeled civilizations as primitive or advanced, and confidently declared when humanity learned to build, to calculate, to navigate the stars. We've written textbooks that explain the linear march of human progress, from stone tools to bronze, from simple farming to complex societies. But what happens when the earth itself contradicts our certainty? What happens when we dig up objects that simply shouldn't be there? Across every continent, in museums and private collections, in university labs and locked vaults, there exist artifacts that whisper of a different story. Some are impossibly advanced for their time. Others depict knowledge that their creators supposedly never possessed. A few are so anomalous that mainstream archaeology has chosen, perhaps wisely, to simply look the other way. These objects don't fit comfortably into our historical narrative. They're puzzle pieces from a different picture entirely, forced into a frame where they clearly don't belong. The ancient Greeks had no business creating analog computers. Medieval mapmakers couldn't have charted Antarctica's coastline beneath its ice. And yet, here we are, staring at evidence that suggests they did exactly that. Perhaps our ancestors were far more capable than we give them credit for. Perhaps lost civilizations rose and fell, leaving only whispers in stone and metal. Or perhaps, and this is where it gets truly fascinating, we've fundamentally misunderstood the timeline of human achievement. These aren't wild tales from conspiracy theorists or pseudo-scientific fantasies. These are real objects you can visit, touch, and study. Many sit in prestigious museums. Others have been carbon dated, X-rayed, and analyzed by the world's leading experts. And still, they remain unexplained. The scientific community offers theories, of course, some plausible, others reaching. But the honest truth is that we simply don't know. And perhaps that's what makes them so captivating. In an age where we can sequence DNA and land rovers on Mars, these ancient riddles remain unsolved. Let's explore ancient artifacts that might rewrite everything we know about human civilization. Some will challenge your understanding of technology. Others will question the very timeline of recorded history. And a few might just make you wonder if we're the first advanced civilization this planet has ever known. Prepare yourself for a journey through time, mystery, and the limits of human knowledge.
The first is the Antikythera mechanism, the ancient computer. In a small museum in Athens, behind protective glass, sits what may be the most sophisticated device from the ancient world, a corroded lump of bronze and wood that spent 2,000 years at the bottom of the sea. The Antikythera mechanism is often called the world's first analog computer, but that designation feels almost inadequate for what this object represents. This is a machine that predicts eclipses, tracks planetary movements, and calculates the positions of the sun and moon with stunning accuracy. It was built around 100 BCE, during a time when the rest of humanity was supposedly scratching marks on clay tablets. Imagine the scene of its discovery. Greek sponge divers working near the island of Antikythera in 1901 stumbled upon an ancient shipwreck. Among the salvaged cargo, statues, pottery, the typical treasures of the ancient Mediterranean, was this strange, encrusted object. For decades, it sat in storage, its true nature hidden beneath layers of marine concretion. Only when researchers began to clean and study it did the impossible become apparent. This wasn't a simple astrolabe or sundial. This was something far more complex. Inside the mechanism are at least 30 bronze gears, precisely cut and calibrated to work in harmony. When operated by turning a hand crank, these gears would rotate dials on the device's face, showing the positions of celestial bodies with remarkable precision. X-ray imaging has revealed inscriptions that serve as an ancient user's manual explaining how to operate this marvel. The engineering tolerances are so fine, the mathematical understanding so advanced, that modern researchers struggle to comprehend how it was even possible with ancient tools. Here's what makes this truly unsettling. Nothing remotely comparable appears in the historical record for at least another 1,000 years. The technology required to create this device, differential gearing, complex astronomical calculations, precision metalwork, simply vanishes from human civilization after the mechanism's creation. It's as if someone built a laptop in the Stone Age, used it for a while, and then humanity collectively forgot that computers were even possible. We have no precursors, no evolutionary steps showing how Greeks developed this technology. It simply appears, fully formed, and then disappears. Some researchers suggest this was the work of the legendary inventor Archimedes or his followers. Perhaps there was an entire tradition of complex mechanism making that history has simply lost. After all, the Library of Alexandria burned, and countless ancient texts have been destroyed over millennia. Maybe devices like this were once common, built by a sophisticated scientific community whose knowledge was wiped out by war, fire, or the simple passage of time. But that's speculation. What we're left with is a machine that demonstrates a level of technical sophistication that shouldn't exist in the ancient world. The mechanism could predict solar eclipses, track the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games, and even account for the irregular orbit of the moon. Modern reconstructions have proven that it works exactly as designed. Scientists from organizations like NASA have studied it, marveling at its complexity. Yet no ancient text explicitly describes such a device. No contemporary accounts explain how it was made or who made it. It exists in isolation, an anomaly that refuses to fit our understanding of technological progress. What's even more provocative is what this implies about lost knowledge. If the ancient Greeks could build this, what else could they create? What other technologies have been lost to time? And perhaps most importantly, what does this tell us about the non-linear nature of human progress? We like to imagine civilization as a steady climb upward, each generation building on the last. But the Antikythera of mechanism suggests something different. That knowledge can be gained and lost, that humanity can reach extraordinary heights and then fall back into darkness. The mechanism sits in its display case, a 2,000-year-old challenge to every assumption we hold about ancient capabilities. And yet, it's just the beginning. But the next discovery makes this one look simple.
The Baghdad Battery, Ancient Electricity. In the basement of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, before the chaos of war scattered and destroyed countless artifacts, there sat a small clay jar that has sparked one of archaeology's most heated debates. The Baghdad Battery, as it's called, is deceptively simple. A terracotta vessel about 5 inches tall containing a copper cylinder, which in turn encases an iron rod. Corroded and ancient, it looks like nothing special. But here's the problem. When you add an acidic solution to this configuration, it produces an electric current. The jar was discovered in 1936 near Baghdad, at a Parthian site dating back to around 250 BCE to 250 CE. German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig found several of these objects and immediately noticed something unusual about their construction. The copper cylinder had been soldered with a lead-tin alloy, a technique familiar to metalworkers. The iron rod showed evidence of acid corrosion. The jar was sealed with bitumen. To Koenig, trained in both archaeology and engineering, the configuration looked suspiciously like a primitive galvanic cell, what we would call a battery. Here's where the controversy begins. Mainstream archaeology largely dismisses the idea that these were batteries, suggesting instead that they were used to store sacred scrolls. After all, why would ancient Parthians need electricity? They had no light bulbs, no electric motors, no conceivable use for electrical current. The idea seems absurd on its face, but then came the experiments. Researchers have built exact replicas of the Baghdad battery, filled them with vinegar or wine, acidic substances the Parthians certainly had access to, and successfully generated voltage. Not much, perhaps, a volt or two, but genuine electrical current nonetheless. So if they could produce electricity, even accidentally, what might they have done with it? One tantalizing theory involves electroplating. We know the ancient world was obsessed with gilding objects, covering base metals with thin layers of gold or silver. Traditional gilding methods involved either hammering gold leaf onto a surface or using mercury, a toxic and dangerous process. But electroplating, using a small electrical current to deposit metal ions onto an object, would have been cleaner, more efficient, and capable of achieving incredibly thin, even coatings. Some ancient artifacts show gilding so fine and uniform that modern metallurgists have wondered how it was achieved. Could the Parthians have stumbled upon electrochemistry 2,000 years before Luigi Galvani and Alessandro Volta supposedly invented the battery? It's not impossible. Many scientific discoveries throughout history have been made by accident. Someone might have noticed that certain metal combinations in acidic solutions produced a tingling sensation. Perhaps they experimented, refined the process, and found practical applications. The fact that we haven't found extensive written records of this technology doesn't mean it didn't exist. It could have been a trade secret, knowledge guarded by a small guild of craftsmen and lost when they died. Critics point out that no ancient texts describe batteries or electrical phenomena. They argue that the jars were simply storage vessels, and any electrical properties are coincidental. They note that electricity would have been frightening and inexplicable to ancient peoples who attributed such phenomena to the gods. But other scholars counter that the ancient world was far more scientifically curious than we often acknowledge. The Greeks experimented with static electricity. Ancient peoples observed lightning, electric eels, and magnetic stones. The conceptual gap between those observations and a primitive battery isn't necessarily as vast as we imagine. The truth is, we may never know for certain. The Iraq Museum was looted during the 2003 invasion, and many of the original Baghdad batteries are now lost or damaged. The few that remain are studied, debated, and replicated in labs around the world. Each experiment yields slightly different results, and each researcher brings their own biases to the interpretation. What we're left with is a profound uncertainty, a small clay jar that might represent nothing more than ancient storage, or might be evidence of electrical knowledge that predates the modern world by 2 millennia. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is how easily such knowledge could vanish. If the Baghdad batteries were indeed used for electroplating or some other electrical purpose, and if that knowledge was held by a small number of craftsmen, it would take only one generation of disruption, war, plague, economic collapse for the technology to disappear entirely. Future archaeologists might find the artifacts, puzzle over their purpose, and never quite grasp what they were looking at. Sound familiar? That's exactly where we find ourselves today, staring at these clay jars and wondering if we're missing something obvious. The Baghdad battery remains one of archaeology's great enigmas, a humble object that raises profound questions about ancient capabilities and lost knowledge. But as strange as this mystery is, the next artifact takes geographical impossibility to an entirely new level.
The Piri Reis map, the impossible coastline. In 1929, during the renovation of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, workers discovered something extraordinary tucked away in the palace archives. A map, drawn on gazelle skin, dated to 1513 CE. The cartographer was Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral and skilled mapmaker. At first glance, it seemed like a valuable historical document, certainly, but not particularly mysterious. Then researchers began to study it more closely. What they found would challenge everything we think we know about the age of exploration. The Piri Reis map shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and, most controversially, the northern coast of Antarctica. Now, here's the problem. In 1513, Antarctica hadn't been discovered yet. The continent wouldn't be officially sighted until 1820, more than 3 centuries later. But that's not even the strangest part. The map appears to show the coastline of Antarctica, not as it exists today, buried under miles of ice, but as it would have looked before glaciation. The topographical features, the bays and rivers, match the actual geography beneath the ice, a geography that wouldn't be confirmed until seismic surveys in the 1950s. How could a Turkish admiral in 1513 have access to such information? Piri Reis himself provides a partial answer in notes written on the map. He explains that he compiled it from approximately 20 source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, others captured from Spanish sailors who had sailed with Columbus. He claims to have used ancient maps from the Library of Alexandria and other sources lost to time. In other words, Piri Reis wasn't claiming to have discovered Antarctica himself. He was copying from maps that already existed, maps that were already ancient when he found them. This raises a staggering possibility. Did some ancient civilization, long before recorded history, map the entire world? The accuracy of the Piri Reis map, particularly its depiction of South America's coastline, is remarkably precise for the early 16th century. It shows the correct longitude of features, something that European navigators struggled with for another 200 years. It depicts geographical details that Spanish and Portuguese explorers were only just beginning to chart. And then there's Antarctica, sitting there at the bottom of the map like an inconvenient fact that refuses to be explained away. Skeptics have offered various explanations. Some suggest that the Antarctic coastline is actually a distorted representation of South America's southern tip, stretched and warped by cartographic errors. Others argue that Piri Reis was engaging in speculative geography, filling in blank spaces on his map with imaginary landmasses that just so happened, by sheer coincidence, to resemble Antarctica. Mainstream historians generally prefer these explanations, uncomfortable with the implications of the alternative. But the alternative is genuinely compelling.
If the map does show pre-glacial Antarctica, it would require source materials dating back at least 6,000 years, possibly much longer. It would suggest that an advanced seafaring civilization existed during or before the last ice age, capable of global navigation and sophisticated cartography. It would mean that this civilization somehow mapped the entire world, including coastlines that would later be buried under ice, and that fragments of these maps survived through millennia, copied and recopied until one ended up in the hands of an Ottoman admiral who probably didn't fully understand what he was looking at. The map's projection is another mystery. Modern analysis suggests it may use a type of projection that requires advanced mathematics and a spherical understanding of the Earth, knowledge that medieval mapmakers supposedly lacked. The level of detail in certain regions exceeds what 16th century explorers could have known. Mountains in South America are shown inland, correctly positioned years before Europeans penetrated those regions. The map seems to know too much. Piri Reis himself became a victim of palace intrigue and was eventually executed in 1553, his other works scattered or lost. We have only fragments of his complete map. About 1/3 of the original survives. What knowledge might the rest have contained? What other impossibilities might have been charted on that gazelle skin? The surviving portion hangs in the Library of Congress, studied by cartographers, historians, and researchers who still can't fully agree on what they're looking at. The map forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about historical knowledge and how it's transmitted. Perhaps ancient civilizations were far more advanced in certain areas, navigation, astronomy, cartography, than we acknowledge. Perhaps information can survive for millennia through copies of copies, each generation losing a bit of the original context until the knowledge becomes mysterious, even to those who possess it. Or perhaps we're simply misinterpreting a 16th century map, seeing patterns that aren't really there, driven by our desire to find ancient mysteries. But one thing is certain: the Piri Reis map doesn't fit comfortably into our historical narrative. It's a document that seems to know too much, drawn by a man who claimed to be working from sources far older than anyone can verify. And whether it's evidence of a lost civilization or simply a cartographic anomaly, it remains one of the most tantalizing mysteries from the age of exploration. Yet as impossible as an ancient map of Antarctica seems, the next artifact suggests ancient people were reaching for the skies in ways we never imagined.
The Saqqara bird, ancient aviation, sitting in a drawer at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo for decades, labeled simply as a wooden bird figurine, was an object that caught the attention of Dr. Khalil Messiha in 1969. Messiha, an Egyptologist who also happened to be passionate about aviation, noticed something unusual about this little wooden carving recovered from the Saqqara tomb complex. It wasn't just any bird. Its proportions, its shape, the way its wings and tail were configured, it looked less like a decorative bird and more like a model airplane. The Saqqara bird, as it came to be known, dates to approximately 200 BCE, crafted during the Ptolemaic period of ancient Egypt. It's made of sycamore wood, weighs just over an ounce, and measures about 6 inches long with a 7-inch wingspan. At first glance, it does resemble a bird. It has eyes painted on the front and vaguely bird-like features. But here's what Messiha paws. The wings are perfectly flat and aerodynamically shaped, not curved like a bird's wings would be in flight. The tail is vertical, like a rudder, rather than horizontal, like a bird's tail. And the overall configuration bears a striking resemblance to a modern glider. When Messiha publicly suggested that this might be an ancient model of a flying machine, the academic community largely dismissed the idea. After all, the ancient Egyptians had no concept of aviation, right? They couldn't have understood aerodynamics or the principles of flight. The suggestion seemed like pure fantasy, the kind of ancient astronaut theorizing that serious scholars avoid. But Messiha wasn't so easily deterred. He had models built based on the Saqqara bird's proportions, and when properly balanced and weighted, these replicas could glide through the air with surprising stability. The debate intensified when other researchers began examining the artifact more closely. Unlike typical ancient Egyptian bird carvings, which usually show wings in a curved position and clearly represent specific species, the Saqqara bird has a configuration that seems almost engineered. The dihedral angle of the wings, the slight upward tilt, is similar to what you'd see in modern gliders for stability. The weight distribution suggests someone understood balance and center of gravity. Could this have been an accidental configuration, a toy bird that just happened to have aerodynamic properties? Or was it deliberately designed as a model for something larger? Proponents of the aviation theory point to ancient Egyptian mythology and texts that occasionally reference flying machines or gods who traveled through the sky in boats. They note that cultures around the world have legends of flight that we typically dismiss as metaphorical or mythological. But what if some of these stories were based on actual experiments or observations? What if ancient engineers, through trial and error, discovered basic principles of aerodynamics? Building a glider doesn't require advanced metallurgy or modern materials, just wood, fabric, and an understanding of how air flows over a wing surface. Skeptics counter that the object is clearly decorative, possibly used in religious ceremonies or as a child's toy. They argue that any aerodynamic properties are coincidental, the result of aesthetic choices rather than engineering calculations. They point out that there's no evidence of larger flying machines in ancient Egypt, no depictions in tomb paintings, no written records describing aviation experiments. If the Egyptians had mastered even primitive gliders, surely there would be more evidence. The absence of such evidence, they argue, is telling. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, as the saying goes. Ancient Egypt spans thousands of years, and countless artifacts have been lost to time. Organic materials like wood and fabric decay rapidly in most conditions. If someone had built experimental gliders from these materials, we'd be unlikely to find remains after millennia. And tomb paintings typically depicted religious and ceremonial activities. Everyday technological experiments might not have warranted artistic documentation. We're left trying to reconstruct ancient capabilities from fragments and inference. The Saqqara bird could be exactly what mainstream archaeology suggests, a simple toy or religious symbol shaped like a bird. But it could also represent something far more intriguing, evidence that ancient peoples experimented with flight long before the Wright brothers took to the skies at Kitty Hawk. Perhaps an ancient inventor, watching birds soar on thermal currents over the Nile, wondered if humans could do the same. Perhaps they built models, tested designs, and created these small wooden demonstrations of aerodynamic principles they had discovered through observation and experimentation. The object remains in the Egyptian Museum, still labeled as a bird figurine, still dividing opinion among researchers. Some see an ancient toy. Others see a tantalizing hint of lost technological knowledge. And perhaps the most honest answer is that we simply don't know. We're looking at a small piece of wood carved 2,000 years ago, trying to read the mind of its creator, attempting to understand whether they were crafting religious art or conducting aviation research. The Saqqara bird keeps its secrets, suspended in that uncertain space between artifact and evidence, between history and mystery. But while this object might suggest ancient dreams of flight, the next discovery challenges something far more fundamental, the very timeline of human civilization.
The London Hammer, the artifact that shouldn't exist. In 1936, Max Hahn and his wife Emma were walking along Red Creek near London, Texas, when they noticed a piece of wood protruding from a rock formation. Curious, they took the stone home, and years later their son broke it open to reveal something impossible. An iron hammer, its wooden handle partially fossilized, embedded in solid rock. The rock formation was Cretaceous limestone, supposedly over 100 million years old. And yet there it was, a clearly manufactured metal tool, trapped in stone that predated human existence by tens of millions of years. The London hammer, as it came to be called, is a modest object, a simple iron hammerhead attached to a wooden handle. The metal shows virtually no rust, despite being, by some accounts, unimaginably ancient. Analysis of the hammer has produced conflicting results and heated debate. The iron composition is unusually pure, with very low sulfur and chlorine content, suggesting manufacturing methods that shouldn't exist in ancient or prehistoric contexts. The wood has partially mineralized, a process that typically takes vast amounts of time, and the rock encasing it appears to be genuine sedimentary stone formed through natural processes. Here's where things get complicated. Mainstream geologists argue that the hammer isn't actually embedded in Cretaceous rock, but rather in a mineral concretion, a hard shell that can form around objects relatively quickly when minerals precipitate from groundwater. In other words, someone dropped or lost a hammer in the 19th or early 20th century. It ended up in a creek bed, and minerals from the water cemented around it, making it appear ancient. This explanation is straightforward, requires no rewriting of human history, and fits with known geological processes. Problem solved, right? Not so fast. Supporters of the hammer's anomalous nature point out several issues with the conventional explanation. First, the mineralization of the wooden handle suggests a much longer timescale than a century or two. Wood doesn't typically fossilize or permineralize in such a short period. Second, the purity of the iron is unusual. Early 20th century tools would have higher impurity levels. Third, and perhaps most intriguingly, when researchers have sectioned the rock formation itself, it shows characteristics consistent with ancient sedimentary rock, not recent concretion. The debate continues, with neither side willing to concede ground. The hammer has become something of a cause célèbre in creationist circles, used as evidence that geological dating methods are flawed and that humans and dinosaurs might have coexisted. These claims have, understandably, made mainstream scientists reluctant to engage seriously with the artifact. When an object becomes a symbol in ideological battles, objective analysis often gets lost. The hammer sits now in the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas, where it's presented as proof of a young Earth, a context that virtually guarantees it will be dismissed by conventional archaeology and geology. But setting aside ideological interpretations, the London hammer raises legitimate questions about how we assess anomalous artifacts. If we found a similar object in a different context, without the baggage of creation science associations, would we evaluate it more objectively? How do we handle discoveries that challenge our chronologies without completely abandoning scientific methods? The problem is that legitimate mysteries often get entangled with fringe theories, making it difficult to separate genuine enigmas from pseudoscientific claims. The metal composition analysis is perhaps most interesting from a purely technical standpoint. Modern metallurgists who have examined the hammer note that the iron has characteristics consistent with high-quality smelting. It's not primitive bloomery iron with slag inclusions. It's not the high-carbon steel you'd expect from industrial processes. It occupies a strange middle ground, well-crafted but not explicable through known historical metallurgy. Of course, the counter-argument is that we don't have complete records of all metallurgical techniques used throughout history, and unusual compositions don't necessarily indicate anomalous age. The fossilization of the wooden handle is equally puzzling. Permineralization, the process by which organic material is gradually replaced by minerals, typically requires specific conditions: burial in sediment, presence of mineral-rich water, and considerable time. Some scientists suggest that under the right circumstances, this process can occur more rapidly than usually assumed. Others argue that the handle shows genuine fossilization that would require thousands, if not millions of years. Without more extensive testing, which the artifact's current custodians seem reluctant to allow, we're left with competing claims and no definitive answers. Perhaps the London hammer is exactly what skeptics claim it is:
a 19th century tool that got encased in mineral deposits and has been misinterpreted by those seeking evidence for their preconceived notions. Or perhaps it's something more genuinely anomalous, an out-of-place artifact that doesn't fit our understanding of the past. The truth is, we may never know for certain. The hammer exists in a kind of archaeological purgatory, too contaminated by ideology to be studied objectively, too intriguing to be completely dismissed. It's a reminder that not all mysteries get solved, and sometimes the stories we tell about objects reveal more about us than about the objects themselves. Yet as strange as a hammer in ancient rock might be, the next artifact rewrites the very history of human kingship.
The Sumerian king list, the immortal rulers.
After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Not 28 years, not 280 years, but 28,800 years. This is how the Sumerian king list, one of ancient Mesopotamia's most important and most baffling documents, describes the earliest rulers of civilization. The text continues, listing king after king, each reigning for tens of thousands of years, until a catastrophic flood wipes everything away, and humanity begins again. The Sumerian king list exists in multiple versions, inscribed on clay tablets and stone prisms dating from around 2100 BCE onward. It presents itself as a straightforward chronological account of kingship in ancient Sumer, listing dynasties from various cities and their lengths of their reigns. Modern historians use it to help reconstruct the early history of Mesopotamia, but those reigns listed before the flood, the antediluvian kings, pose a serious problem. The numbers are absurd. One king rules for 43,200 years, another for 36,000 years. 8 kings total, spanning a combined 241,200 years. Then comes the flood, the same catastrophic deluge mentioned in countless ancient Middle Eastern texts, including later biblical accounts. After the flood, the king list continues, but something has changed. The reigns become shorter, still impossibly long by modern standards, often lasting several centuries, but no longer stretching into tens of millennia. And as the list progresses through time toward the historical period that we can verify through other records, the durations gradually normalize. By the time we reach kings we know existed from archaeological evidence, the durations are plausible, matching what we'd expect from actual human rulers. So what are we supposed to make of this? Mainstream scholarship treats the astronomical reign lengths as mythological or symbolic. Perhaps they represent dynasties rather than individual rulers, or perhaps the Sumerians used a different temporal reckoning system that we don't fully understand. Maybe these numbers encode information about astronomical cycles or religious concepts about cosmic time. The antediluvian section is treated as mythology, a legendary prehistory that transitions gradually into actual history as the numbers become more realistic. But here's what's intriguing. The Sumerian king list doesn't read like mythology. It's written in the same straightforward chronological style throughout. There's no narrative flourish, no epic poetry, no explicit indication that the author is shifting from myth to history. It simply lists kings, their capitals, and their reign lengths, treating the 28,800-year reign with the same matter-of-fact tone as the historically verified reigns that come later. The Sumerians themselves seem to regard this as a genuine historical document, not as religious allegory or legend. Could there any be truth to these impossible lifespans? Some theorists suggest that the antediluvian kings might represent memories of a lost civilization, one that existed before catastrophic flooding reshaped Mesopotamia at the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose dramatically as glaciers melted, and the Persian Gulf region experienced significant inundation. Perhaps the kings who ruled before the flood are garbled memories of leaders from this earlier period, their timescales distorted through millennia of oral tradition before being committed to writing.
Others propose that the numbers might be corrupted or based on a different numerical system than scholars assume. Ancient Mesopotamians used a sexagesimal base 60 counting system, which has led some researchers to wonder if translation errors or misunderstandings of numerical notation could explain the astronomical figures. Perhaps a reign of 288 became 28,800 through some scribal error or misinterpretation. But attempts to systematically adjust the numbers to make them plausible have been unconvincing. No simple formula or conversion makes the antediluvian reigns align with realistic human lifespans. The parallels with other ancient flood myths are striking. The biblical book of Genesis also lists antediluvian patriarchs who lived for impossible lengths of time. Methuselah famously lived 969 years according to Scripture. The Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh describes a great flood and survivors who possessed ancient wisdom. Hindu texts describe yugas, vast cycles of time spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Egyptian king lists include reigns of gods and demigods before mortal pharaohs. Cultures worldwide preserve traditions of a time before the flood, when things were different, when beings lived longer, when the world operated under different rules. This could simply be a universal human tendency to mythologize the distant past, to imagine a golden age when heroes were greater and lifespans longer. But it's also possible that these traditions preserve genuine memories of catastrophic events, massive floods, climate upheaval, the end of the Ice Age, that were so traumatic they reshaped human society and remained embedded in cultural memory for thousands of years. The Sumerian king list remains one of archaeology's most puzzling documents. It's simultaneously a valuable historical source and an impossible chronology. It bridges myth and history without clearly delineating where one ends and the other begins. And it forces us to confront difficult questions about how ancient peoples understood time, recorded their past, and what they believed about the origins of civilization. We can read the words, but we're still trying to understand what they really mean. But if ancient king lists challenge our understanding of time, the next artifact challenges our understanding of cultural contact across impossible distances.
The Fuente Magna Bowl, the Sumerian script in Bolivia. In the 1950s, a farmer working near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia discovered a large ceramic bowl roughly the size and shape of a baptismal font. It was covered in strange engravings and inscriptions, which he initially thought were decorative patterns. The bowl eventually made its way to various collectors and researchers, and when experts finally examined it closely, they found something that should be impossible. The inscriptions appeared to be in Sumerian cuneiform, the ancient writing system of Mesopotamia, inscribed on a pre-Columbian artifact found in South America. The Fuente Magna Bowl, as it came to be known, is now one of the most controversial artifacts in all of archaeology. On its interior surface are elaborate pictographs and what appears to be Proto-Sumerian or Sumerian cuneiform script, dating to approximately 3000 BCE if the script identification is correct. The problem is obvious. Sumerian civilization flourished in what is now Iraq, over 8,000 miles from Bolivia. The Atlantic Ocean separates these regions, and in 3000 BCE, according to conventional history, there was no contact whatsoever between the Old World and the New World. The Americas wouldn't be reached by Europeans until thousands of years later. So how did Sumerian writing end up on a bowl in Bolivia? The mainstream archaeological community has largely dismissed the artifact as a hoax or a modern creation, possibly made to deceive collectors or to promote fringe historical theories. After all, there's no chain of custody documenting the bowl's discovery. It appeared, without clear provenance, brought forward by individuals with no archaeological credentials. The lack of scientific excavation context makes it impossible to verify through standard archaeological methods, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which the Fuente Magna bowl doesn't quite provide. But the artifact has its defenders, researchers who have studied the bowl extensively and argue that dismissing it as a hoax is premature. Linguistic analysis of the script suggests it isn't merely copied from a textbook. The symbols show variations and combinations that are consistent with genuine ancient writing, not modern forgery. Some of the pictographs resemble symbols from the Cuelca tradition, an indigenous South American script tradition that itself remains poorly understood. The ceramic composition and manufacturing techniques appear consistent with pre-Columbian pottery from the region. In short, if it's a hoax, it's an extraordinarily sophisticated one. The inscriptions, when translated by Sumerian language experts, allegedly tell a story of a goddess and maritime people, with references to boats and distant lands. One researcher claims to have identified the name of a Sumerian goddess in the text. Another suggests the script is actually Proto-Sumerian, even older than the classical cuneiform we're familiar with. These interpretations are hotly debated, and many linguists argue that reading ancient scripts is subjective enough that you can often find patterns that support whatever theory you're promoting, especially when the artifact's authenticity is in question. If we entertain the possibility that the Fuente Magna bowl is genuine, the implications are staggering. It would require a complete reassessment of ancient maritime capabilities. Sumerian ships would need to have been far more sophisticated than we imagined, capable of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, a feat that most historians believe was beyond ancient technology. It would suggest cultural exchange between civilizations separated by vast distances, contact that left no other trace in the archaeological record. Or perhaps it points to something even more radical, a common ancestral civilization that influenced both Mesopotamia and South America before diverging into separate cultural streams.
The location of the discovery adds another layer to the mystery. Lake Titicaca sits at over 12,000 feet above sea level in the Andes Mountains. It's one of the highest navigable lakes in the world and has been sacred to Andean cultures for millennia. The Tiwanaku civilization, which flourished near the lake before the Inca, built extraordinary stone monuments and possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Some researchers have speculated about connections between Tiwanaku and other ancient civilizations, noting architectural similarities and shared mythological themes. Could the Fuente Magna bowl be evidence of this connection, a tangible link between the ancient Middle East and pre-Columbian South America? Alternative theories suggest that the script might not be Sumerian at all, but rather a convergent evolution, the possibility that different cultures independently developed similar-looking symbols for similar concepts. Writing systems do sometimes show surprising similarities across cultures with no known contact. But the level of similarity between the Fuente Magna inscriptions and genuine Sumerian script goes beyond simple geometric shapes. If independent invention is the explanation, it would be an extraordinary coincidence. The bowl remains in a museum in La Paz, Bolivia, where it continues to attract researchers, skeptics, and enthusiasts. Some come to prove it's genuine, others to expose it as fake. Neither side has definitively succeeded. The artifact exists in a kind of archaeological limbo, too problematic to accept, too intriguing to completely ignore. It's a reminder that not every mystery fits neatly into our understanding of the past, and that sometimes objects appear that challenge every assumption we hold about ancient isolation and cultural development. But while the Fuente Magna bowl suggests impossible cultural contact, the next artifact is shrouded in religious mystery and scientific controversy.
The Shroud of Turin, the image that defies explanation. In a climate-controlled case in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, lies perhaps the most studied artifact in human history. A 14-foot-long linen cloth bearing the faint image of a crucified man. The Shroud of Turin has been subjected to more scientific analysis than almost any other archaeological object, examined by chemists, physicists, textile experts, art historians, and forensic specialists. And despite all this scrutiny, despite decades of research and countless peer-reviewed papers, we still cannot definitively explain how the image was created. The shroud shows the front and back of a bearded man who appears to have suffered injuries consistent with Roman crucifixion. Marks from scourging across the body, wounds in the wrists and feet, a puncture in the side, and what looks like injuries from a crown of thorns. The image is incredibly detailed, showing anatomical accuracy that would be difficult for a medieval artist to achieve. But here's what makes it truly mysterious. The image isn't painted, drawn, or created by any conventional artistic method. It exists only on the topmost fibers of the cloth, penetrating no deeper than a fraction of a millimeter. There are no brushstrokes, no pigment accumulation, no directionality consistent with hand application. For believers, the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, a miraculous imprint created at the moment of resurrection. For skeptics, it's an elaborate medieval forgery, created by an unknown artist using techniques we still don't fully understand. The Catholic Church itself maintains a carefully neutral position, neither officially declaring it authentic nor dismissing it as fake. But the scientific evidence is genuinely perplexing, offering support for both interpretations while definitively proving neither. The most famous scientific test came in 1988 when 3 laboratories independently carbon-dated samples from the shroud. The results were consistent. The linen dated to approximately 1260 to 1390 CE, placing its creation firmly in the medieval period. For many, this settled the matter. The shroud was a medieval artifact, end of story. But then came the complications. Critics of the carbon dating pointed out that the samples were taken from a corner of the cloth that had been handled frequently and possibly repaired with newer material. The entire shroud had also survived a fire in 1532, and the carbon from smoke and the heat might have contaminated the samples, skewing the results toward a more recent date. Subsequent research has only deepened the mystery. In the 1970s, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, a team of scientists from various disciplines, conducted extensive non-destructive testing. They found that the image was formed by some kind of chemical process that modified the topmost cellulose fibers, essentially aging or scorching them in a pattern that creates the image. But they found no paint, no dye, no artist's medium. The image has photographic negative properties. When photographed, the negative reveals even more detail than the positive image, showing 3-dimensional information encoded in the intensity of the discoloration. How could a medieval forger create such an image? To produce the negative effect, they would need to understand photography centuries before it was invented. To encode 3-dimensional information, they'd need knowledge of how light and shadow interact with human anatomy in ways that weren't formally understood until much later. And to create an image that exists only on surface fibers without any underlying sketch or directional application, that remains beyond our ability to easily reproduce even with modern technology. Attempts to recreate the shroud using medieval techniques have produced images that look similar from a distance, but fail under microscopic examination. Pollen analysis has added another fascinating dimension to the debate. Botanists have identified pollen grains on the shroud from plant species native to the Jerusalem area, suggesting the cloth was at some point in the Middle East. Trevine limestone particles on the fabric match quarries near Jerusalem. But skeptics note that such evidence could be explained if the shroud passed through that region at any point in its history, not necessarily in the 1st century. Pollen can contaminate artifacts through various means, and limestone particles could have been added intentionally to make the forgery more convincing. The blood stains on the shroud present their own mysteries.
Forensic analysis suggests they show patterns consistent with actual contact blood stains and drip patterns, not painted representations of blood. The blood type appears to be AB, relatively common in the Middle East. Some researchers claim to have identified human DNA in the samples, though these findings are controversial. But perhaps most intriguing is that the bloodstains appear to have been on the cloth before the image was formed, as if the image-creating process respected the presence of the bloodstains. Recent research using modern imaging techniques has revealed even more detail in the image, including what might be coins placed over the eyes, a Jewish burial custom, and faint lettering that some interpret as Latin inscriptions. Each new analysis seems to generate more questions than answers. The shroud remains the subject of ongoing research, with new papers published regularly, each offering slight support to one interpretation or the other, without definitively resolving the central mystery. Perhaps what makes the Shroud of Turin so compelling is that it exists at the intersection of faith and science, challenging both to explain something that doesn't fit neatly into either worldview. It's simultaneously a religious relic and a scientific puzzle, an object that refuses to be comfortably categorized. Whether it's the burial cloth of Christ or an inexplicable medieval creation, it represents something extraordinary about human capability, belief, and the persistence of mystery in an age that claims to have explanations for everything. Yet while the shroud's origins remain debated, the next artifacts were designed to be mysterious from the very beginning.
The crystal skulls, beautiful fakes or ancient mysteries. They gleam in museum displays and private collections worldwide. Human skulls carved from solid quartz crystal, some weighing several pounds, crafted with such precision that they seem almost to glow from within. The crystal skulls have captivated imaginations for over a century, featuring in countless documentaries, books, and even Hollywood films. They've been attributed to ancient Mesoamerican civilizations, credited with mystical properties, and claimed to be repositories of ancient knowledge. But the real story of the crystal skulls is somehow more fascinating than the legends. It's a tale of 19th century forgery, archaeological ambition, and how we create mysteries to satisfy our hunger for the inexplicable. The most famous of these skulls is the Mitchell Hedges skull, named after British adventurer F.A. Mitchell Hedges, who claimed his daughter Anna discovered it in 1924 while excavating a Mayan ruin in Belize. According to the story, Anna found the skull buried beneath a collapsed altar on her 17th birthday. Mitchell Hedges later described it as at least 3,600 years old, carved by the Maya using techniques that involved rubbing the crystal with sand for 300 years. The skull is life-sized, anatomically accurate, and includes a detachable jaw. When illuminated from below, it produces an eerie effect, seeming to glow from within. For decades, it was presented as proof of ancient advanced technology. The problem is, almost none of that story is true. Modern research has revealed that Mitchell Hedges likely purchased the skull at a Sotheby's auction in London in 1943, years after the supposed discovery. No independent witnesses ever corroborated Anna's discovery story. And most damningly, technological analysis of the skull shows tool marks consistent with modern rotary equipment, not ancient hand-carving techniques. The quartz crystal itself, while natural, was likely sourced from Brazil and worked using jeweler's tools available in the late 19th or early 20th century.
This pattern holds true for virtually every crystal skull that's been scientifically examined. The British Museum has one, acquired in the 1890s and long displayed as a masterpiece of Aztec craftsmanship. In 2005, after technological analysis revealed modern tool marks, the museum quietly changed its labeling to acknowledge it as a 19th century creation. The Smithsonian has a skull that was supposedly found in Mexico. Analysis revealed it was made with jeweler's wheels that left microscopic traces in the crystal. Skull after skull, when subjected to rigorous examination, shows the hallmarks of relatively modern manufacture. So why were they made? And who made them? The answer lies in the 19th century's obsession with pre-Columbian artifacts and a lucrative market for such objects. As interest in ancient American civilizations grew following early excavations, European and American collectors clamored for authentic artifacts. This created a powerful incentive for forgery. Skilled craftsmen, likely operating in Germany where advanced gem-cutting technology existed, created these skulls to satisfy demand. They were probably initially sold with ambiguous or no provenance, allowing dealers to construct more exciting backstories as they passed through various hands. The crystal skulls succeeded because they matched what people wanted ancient artifacts to be: mysterious, beautiful, and technologically impressive. They fulfilled a narrative about lost advanced civilizations that was popular in the 19th century and remains appealing today. The Aztec and Maya had built impressive cities and possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Surely they could have carved intricate crystal skulls. The fact that quartz crystal is difficult to carve using primitive techniques only added to the mystique, suggesting ancient secrets and lost methods.
But here's where the story gets interesting. Just because most or all of the famous crystal skulls are modern forgeries doesn't mean that pre-Columbian peoples never carved crystal. They absolutely did. Mesoamerican cultures worked jade, obsidian, and other hard stones into intricate forms. Smaller crystal carvings have been found in authenticated archaeological contexts. The issue isn't whether ancient peoples could carve crystal. It's whether these specific, large, elaborate skulls are genuinely ancient, and the evidence strongly suggests they're not. The crystal skulls have become a case study in how archaeological myths are created and perpetuated. Once an object is believed to be mysterious and ancient, that belief becomes remarkably resistant to evidence. Even after museums acknowledge the skulls as modern forgeries, many people continued to believe in their ancient origins. The skulls had become symbols, vessels for ideas about lost wisdom and ancient knowledge. Scientific analysis could reveal tool marks in modern manufacturing techniques, but it couldn't compete with the emotional appeal of the mystery. Perhaps the real lesson of the crystal skulls is about ourselves and what we project onto the past. We want to believe that ancient peoples possess knowledge we've lost, that there are mysteries still unsolved, that not everything can be explained by scientific analysis. The skulls themselves are beautiful objects, masterfully crafted even if they're not ancient. They represent impressive artisanship, just not the kind we wanted them to represent. And in some ways, the story of their creation, the 19th century forgers who fooled museums and collectors for over a century, is more intriguing than the myths about ancient Maya craftsmen working for centuries to carve them. The crystal skulls remind us to question narratives, to demand evidence, and to be wary of stories that confirm what we already want to believe. They're a humbling reminder that archaeology is a scientific discipline, not a treasure hunt for validation of mystical theories. But even as we acknowledge their modern origin, we can appreciate the role they played in capturing imaginations and inspiring curiosity about the ancient world. Sometimes the fake mysteries teach us as much as the real ones. Yet not every mysterious object from the past can be so easily dismissed. The next artifacts come with their own puzzling story.